Hi, Louise. How are you?
Very well, thanks. And you, Siddharth?
I'm great. It's good to catch up with you again, especially on today's topic where astrology meets politics and how the planetary movements shape our future. And my first question to you is what recent astrological transit or planetary alignments do you believe are most influencing current political tensions? I mean, global political tensions.
Okay, well, I mean, there's a lot going on, but the one thing that I want to focus on is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So just to sort of set the scene, we've had three outer planets changing signs. We've got Pluto that at the end of last year moved, from Capricorn into Aquarius. We've got Neptune that's just moved into Aries from Pisces, and we've got Saturn that's also moved into Aries from Pisces, and we have Gemini moving into Uranus moving into Gemini. So yeah, this is quite an extraordinary amount of change. Each of these things on their own is significant, and to have three outer planets changing signs in such a short space of time, I think we can all feel that things are sort of a little bit upside down. But the thing those things are really long cycles, and we will sort of look at that. But the thing that I really want to focus on is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because that's a 36-year cycle, and we will resonate with that, in history. And it's going to be exact in February 2026, and the tension is building because those two planets are coming close to one another now that they've both moved into Aries. So they will go backwards, back into Pisces a bit, and then finally move into Aries, earlier next year. But there's no doubt that we can feel the tension. And what's really interesting about this conjunction is that it is happening at 0 degrees of Aries, and that's an incredibly powerful point in the zodiac, because it's zero, it's the start, it's seen as the world axis. I mean, it's really incredibly, it's like a powerful reset, I suppose. And just thinking back, this aspect was last exact in 1989 when the Berlin Wall collapsed and communism collapsed. And in that time as well, there were big protests in China with the Tiananmen Square massacre, and so those were quelled. But there was a significant change in the communist world, across Eastern Europe, and essentially the map was redrawn. And actually that cycle is also really interesting for us as South Africans, because it changed the game for South Africa, because we got caught up in a changing world order, and the apartheid government had to adapt. And next minute the ANC were unbanned, and it really sort of helped us on our democratic journey. So that was all incredibly powerful and positive, actually. And that cycle is very connected to changes in Russia, right from the 1917, the Bolshevik revolution, and the shift from a monarchy to communism, and then in 52, 53 when Stalin died, and then in 89 when communism collapsed, and it's so it's coming again. And there's no doubt that things will change. And if we just think about those two planets, Saturn is the authority, whether it's the corporation or the government, and it's very much seen, in terms of bricks and mortar and processes and procedures, and it's solid, and it should be standing forever, basically, and ideally. And Neptune is the dream, the ideal, and I suppose what this conjunction is talking to us about is that in many ways the ideal hasn't really manifested as it was originally intended. It's been corrupted, and so Neptune is also the deceiver, and now it sort of describes that this thing needs to dissolve so that it can be reimagined, once again with the great ideal. So it's about that dreams and aspirations, but how do we make them realistic and achievable? And so I mean, it's interesting also, that Neptune's associated with deception, but also addiction, drugs and alcohol and pharmaceutical drugs, and and all of those problems that we see in society where it essentially is corrupted. And what's also interesting now is that these planets are going to be in Aries, and Aries it's an action-orientated sign. Its ruler is Mars. Mars is the god of war. There's an urgency and a need to kind of like act. And and Saturn's not that comfortable in Aries, and it talks about their consequences to actions. And sometimes those need to be called out if they are not right. And I suppose Neptune speaks to us about Neptune is really trying to sort of seek deeper meaning and understanding and spiritual connection. And it asks us about sacrifices. What sacrifices do we need to make personally and collectively to create and to reach these idealistic dreams that we have about the societies that we, trying to create? So I think on some ways, it's Neptune's also asking us to heal. So take responsibility for ourselves as individuals and heal so that society can heal. And if we're triggered by something, it kind of like implies that we've still got work to do. We need to basically do the work. So it's going to be interesting to see, like social movements that have been a long time coming, things like, death with dignity. There's been quite a bit of movement around the world in terms of being more open to those kind of processes when dealing with end of life. I mean, I suppose there's also been, a lot of pushback from women, particularly in women's sport, around transgender athletes and this sort of separation between sex and gender, and and how we really need to protect women's sport, actually, and it's right that it's a protected space. Many generations of women fought for these rights, basically. And then just the other thing is that we had our democratic election in 1994, but our constitution only got promulgated in 1996, and that was when Saturn was last in Aries. And so it is reminding us of the importance of that document, and almost asking us to check our progress, and where have we fallen down, and what do we still need to achieve? Because there's nothing wrong with that document. You know what I mean? The document is still sets us on the right path, but we clearly haven't, met that, and I suppose it's interesting as well that, Zuma's trial might finally come, he might finally be held accountable. And, that process, that arms deal was in 1999. It's taken an incredibly long time to get to this point. But what the Constitution does and says is that, nobody is above the law, and we are all equal, in the law, and we are a constitutional democracy which has all these checks and balances to protect us from abuse of power. So yes, it's and we definitely are in new territory, with the government of national unity. And yeah, there's clearly lots of tension, and I think there's going to be lots of debate about, policies and the ways that we achieve this long-term agenda. Yeah. So, yeah.
All right. How do you see Pluto's shift into Aquarius shaping collective power structures and social reform movements?
So Pluto was last in Aquarius in the late 1700s, 1777 to 1798. And that was the time of US independence. And, they wanted independence from Britain because they were tired of paying taxes, and they wanted to forge their own path. And it was also the time of the French Revolution, where there was a monarchy that was, quite frankly, completely out of touch with ordinary people's needs on the ground, and particularly, poor people. So, Pluto is always about, the things that we don't like to discuss, debt, tax, death, decay, corruption, all these kind of things. And so, that's coming around again. And, it's going to be in Aquarius for 20 years. So this is not going to happen overnight. But it certainly is a warning to corporations and or governments who are out of touch with the needs of ordinary people, that there could be a revolt. And yes, we've come out of a time where Pluto has been in Capricorn, and we've seen this rampant corruption and greed across the world, across governments, in the public and the private sector. And clearly we understand that story very well in South Africa with our whole state capture, inquiry. And in Capricorn, it means it's more about the top-down, authority figure bearing down on one. And actually, we are reminded with Pluto in Aquarius that actually as individuals, we need to hold those in power accountable. We can't opt out and expect those in authority and power to do the right thing, because we've observed that they can abuse power, and it doesn't end well, basically. So we certainly need to hold those in authority accountable, and keep a check on power. Yeah.
Okay, in your view, how does the astrology of a nation, example its birth chart, reflect or influence political turning points?
So yeah, the birth chart is always, really interesting to look at. And, if you're looking like a year ahead, you would do an Aries English chart for the capital, so for us, it would be Pretoria. But those birth charts tell a story of their own. If you think about our 94 chart, mm-hmm. Saturn is in our second house, which is basically about our economy. And last year we had our Saturn return. So Saturn is telling us that we can no longer be bratty teenagers. We actually have to adult up. And we have to adult up around the economy. And so, Saturn, it's been clearly very obvious that, we have an economy that's struggling. It's not growing. Our currency's under pressure. We are, people don't have money. So there's an enormous amount of pressure economically. We've got these massive unemployment figures, and yet we can't, keep our economy growing. So, we've got quite a few important angular planets, and interestingly, Pluto is going to connect with those. Mercury, the MC, the government, the sun, the leader, the opposition, the ascendant, our image, Jupiter in the 10th house. And this pressure is going to be on our chart from 2025 to 2030. And, Pluto is definitely telling us that we can't carry on doing what we're doing because it's not working. So we have to make some fundamental changes. And those changes are clearly not going to be easy, because we have to let go of the things that are not working, because we're actually harming ourselves. And it also might be that there are certain things that, if you think about what's going to happen with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, the world is going to change. And like 89, we're going to have to respond to a changing world order. So some of these things might be, in a sense, out of our control. But if you think about what Pluto stands for, it's about death, decay, crumbling infrastructure, sewerage, everything that we haven't maintained. And we've got, spiraling debt. It's at a point where it's probably kind of like peaking. We can't ask for more money. Do you know what I mean? We have to think about how we spend our money. So we've kind of like painted ourselves in a corner. But in some ways, it's going to be the transformation that we need to actually reimagine ourselves. So, you know what I mean? So a lot of things are kind of like coming together. We're having to adult up. We're having to take responsibility for, the economy. We're having to think about, how we chart a path forward. And it doesn't look like it's going to be easy, but it looks like it's essential, and I read some columnist years ago saying that, if you live in South Africa, it's like you married to an alcoholic. You know that you need to get out, but you just can't, and it's actually so true. Do you know what I mean? And you think, oh, it can't get worse, and then it feels like it gets worse. So, I do think the next 5 years are going to be really significant for us, also because we have, municipal elections next year, national elections in, 2029. So, and, there's many commentators that, don't think that the ANC will ever regain a majority. So, and I don't think that they will. Do you know what I mean? We are fundamentally in new territory now, and that's good, because it'll be like a watershed in terms of pushing us forward.
Do you see any parallels between past historical eras, example 1960s or 1930s, and current planetary patterns? What can we learn from them?
So, one of the planets that I was alluding to is Uranus, that is going to be changing signs. Uranus has been in Taurus and it's moving into Gemini. And it was last in Gemini in the 40s, 1941 to 1949. So clearly that was World War II. But, towards the end of that process, it was about the reorganization of the world post-World War II. So at that time, based on the horrendous, issue of this world war and the destruction and the loss of life and all those terrible things, bodies were formed like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, NATO, the World Health Organization. So all of these organizations came into being at the end of that period. And I suppose, it's interesting that Trump's arrived and, ripped up, everything in terms of, funding for, the World Health Organization and stuff like that. And I suppose we, need to ask, are those, organizations still fit for purpose? And, they were primarily focused on the rebuilding of Europe. And there's definitely a need for, a recognition of the global order. So it'll be interesting to see, what happens with, those organizations going forward. But also interestingly, if you think about, that late 40s, Israel was founded in May 1948, South Korea in August 1948, India and Pakistan, August 1947. And so it's interesting that those places are in the news, South Africa with our, court case against Israel, for Palestine. There's also a lot of pressure on Israel and traditional allies are even kind of like balking at actually what's going on in Gaza. So, things are unstable, and that is what Uranus is. Uranus is about instability and unpredictability. But it's the disruptor. Do you know what I mean? It wants things to significantly change, and it might feel chaotic, but it is wanting the situation to shift, significantly. And I mean, Trump, he's a Gemini sun with Uranus on his sun, and he has a Uranus transit, on his MC, his Mars, his ascendant. And that's still in play until sort of like April next year. So, Trump, he doesn't want to play by the rules. You know what I mean? He is a loose cannon and he is going to do his own thing. And he does want to disrupt the status quo. So, yeah. Okay, I mean, clearly we don't want, hostilities to boil over into, global conflicts. But the reality is that we are dealing with war in Russia, Ukraine, in Israel, Gaza, in Sudan, through Africa, there are definitely incredibly important and significant global conflicts around the world that we need to be paying attention to. The tension between India and Pakistan, which seems to have died down, but yeah.
Okay, how can astrology help individuals navigate socio-political uncertainty or systematic collapse?
I think, the first thing to say is that we're very small. This is a, huge system, incredibly complex, way bigger than ourselves, impacts across the world. These planetary configurations that we observe are, they're vast, and yet they're just the tip of the iceberg. But if we think back to, say, for example, when Neptune was in Aries, so that was in the late 1800s, 1861 to 1875. That was when slavery was abolished in the US. And if you think back, it seems horrendous that even happened, and yet it did. And there was, pressure to change and for, the freedom of individuals. So, and that was a good thing. So it obviously, and there was lots of conflict, between the North and the South, and the South were in the US, didn't want to give up slaves, and there was a huge amount of pressure. But eventually, the system shifts, and now it's hard to imagine that even happened. And so if you think about something like death with dignity, in time it might feel weird that we allowed people to suffer in their end times, particularly if they were incredibly unwell. So as these social movements change, yes, good does come from all this upheaval, and that's what we need to remind ourselves of. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question here from the comments, if you don't mind me actually asking you.
Yeah.
Sure. All right, let me just open it up here. All right. From Rish Jatan, a quick question. Will India and Pakistan ever sort their conflicts?
Sure. That's I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, it's always possible, and I think a lot of what we see is, a lot of these issues can be resolved with political will.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we need to see that. Yeah.
All right. Which upcoming astrological events should we be watching closely in terms of major global or regional change?
Well, I definitely think, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction on the 20th of February, which we are feeling now. So, yeah, that is definitely going to be the thing to watch.
All right. How do you balance hope and realism when interpreting challenging astro-political indicators?
So, the planets always have a light and a shadow side, and so we need to, understand that and appreciate it, and Saturn is a malefic. It tends to be difficult, but it teaches us important lessons about duties and responsibilities. But equally, when Saturn's around, we can feel stuck or blocked by those in authority, and we can feel incredibly frustrated. But, you look at a planet like Jupiter, which is all about abundance and good things. It's the greatest benefic, but it can also speak about excess and greed. So it's really up to us, to make decisions, almost like, do we want to engage with the light or the shadow? And, do we want to take the high road or the low road? And we do have, choice in that.
Do you think the rise of AI, surveillance, and digital power is reflected astrologically? If so, how?
Well, certainly with Uranus moving into Gemini. Gemini the ruler is Mercury. It's all about communication, trade, transport. How do you collect people and ideas and get product from A to B? That is, the territory of Gemini. So we can expect a lot of disruption, which is what, and innovation, which is what Uranus is trying to do in those sectors. Yes, so certainly, AI is a big part of that. But also it'll be interesting to see, we've got Uber, but, what emerges, after that. And, if you also think about, World War II time, propaganda's always been a thing. And, in that era of the 40s, propaganda was about dropping pamphlets from the sky. If you think about, with all the technology that we have, you know what I mean? Propaganda is well, the reach is quite extraordinary now. And sometimes it's actually hard to tell, what's real and what's not. So we clearly need to be, mindful of all of these things. And like everything, things can be corrupted or else they can be used for good. And it's really up to us to, make those choices. But actually, interestingly, I had a client this week and she was asking about or querying the birth time of her daughter, and she asked ChatGPT, what difference it would make if the time was, an hour later. And, she gave some details, and then she messaged me, and she, because also the question was related to, feeling depressed. Would the time of day, have an impact on that? And I looked at this stuff, and it honestly didn't make any sense. So I said to her, where did you get this information from? Because it's not making any sense. She said to me, Chat GPT. So I think it's also, just to be mindful of the fact that these tools are still youthful. They might make mistakes. You still need to have your wits about you. You know what I mean? You can't just blindly trust that everything that you're getting is correct. You know what I mean? You actually have to have some knowledge yourself to interrogate things and to see, whether it literally makes sense or not. And it's going to be interesting to see what transpires in our world, as astrologers, because clearly things are going to change, and young people are incredibly comfortable with technology and apps and all of those kind of things, and in terms of getting information, and but bite-sized bits probably of information, but for me, there's something so powerful about a consultation, in person and or online, but a consultation that allows a process of healing. And I'm not sure that you can do that without human connection. So as much as all these tools are incredible, we are still human, we are still emotional beings, and we need to be heard, and we need, particularly if we want to heal.
All right. Are there specific planetary placements you associate with political leaders or populist movements?
To me, it's never one thing. There's Trump's got Mars in Leo, and interestingly, he selected a lot of people with Mars in Leo, around him. And so that's, interesting to watch. But just in terms of us, Putin, Ramaphosa, and Xi Jinping were all born between 1952 and 1953. So they were born at that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And this is the big, planetary thing that's coming up, now, and will be exact in February 2026. So it's going to be interesting to see, what happens to these three countries and these leaders, and how, if something changes in the one, if you think about China, they managed to squash those youth protests in 1989. So, yeah, let's see.
All right. My final question to you is, what role do astrologers play today in helping communities make sense of the wider socio-political shifts we are experiencing?
So I think we've got an enormous role to play. Do you know what I mean? And to me, I see it as it's educational. You know what I mean? It's providing information and knowledge and helping people to, join the dots, connect the dots, see the patterns, see the themes, and so to kind of like get that big picture sense, but also then just have a realization that these things are bigger than us, and that actually it's important that we focus on meaningful things for ourselves, and try and navigate the uncertainty and the political ups and downs wherever we are. And basically, I think what I'm trying to say is it doesn't really matter where you are in the world currently. It is all unstable. So moving somewhere else not necessarily going to solve your problems, and I suppose it just reminds us to have gratitude and do simple things. Be in nature, focus on the breath, and yes, find inner stability while things are uncertain externally, because there's no doubt that they are.
Okay, all I got to say thanks so much for your time, and hope to catch up with you soon again.
Great. Thanks, Siddharth. That was fantastic. Thanks for getting in touch and really interesting questions. Yes.
You're welcome. Take care.
Great. Take care. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.